All right, this is Islamic Theology, of course. It's unit number 3 and lecture number 5. It talks about the growth and the origin, growth, and the challenges of Islamic theology and philosophy. Wanted to mention, first of all, in this lecture number 5, that the word for philosophy is falsafa, and this is the Aristotelian logic, and there are admittedly very, very fine distinctions between theology and philosophy, not possible because the study of Islam tends to link them all together, and there is quite a bit of overlap in these two areas. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the Sunni commentaries, but we'll also be mentioning the Hadith, and I trust that it won't be confusing because I will briefly mention some of the commentators and then go on to the Hadith, and then I'll come back to those early commentators on the Quran who are so influential. The sources of information here would first of all would be the primary. We go to some of the various disciplines of philosophy and theology by looking at the people, the agendas, and the approaches. As for philosophy, we'll try to look at the primary works of the philosophers themselves to the extent possible, though admittedly when you do that, there are some things missing. On theology, we will look at some of the early theologians, the earliest of whom is a fellow by the name of Al-Ashri, who died in 935 and who studied law, tradition, and mysticism. I wanted to mention that the Quran, the commentaries, they do have their commentaries on the Quran just like we have our commentaries on the Bible. And to do anything really in Islam, to be of any note at all, you had to have memorized the Quran and done a commentary on it. But the major Sunni literary sources, there are actually some old biographers, and they came up with what they called Sirat literature, Sirat meaning path. It reminds me of that verse in the Quran from chapter 1, the Fatiha, and verse 6, where it says, guide us in the straight way. Sirat al-Mustaqim, guide us in the straight way. It's a prayer that Muslims pray many, many times during the day. And we can use it to point Muslims to Christ. Because when Muslims pray, guide us to the straight path, Sirat al-Mustaqim, remember that Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So you have these early biographers, Ibn Ishaq, who died in the 8th century, and wrote Sirat Rasul Allah, the way of the apostle of Allah. You have Al-Waqidi, who died in the 9th century, Ibn Hashim, who died in the 9th century, and then At-Tabri, who died in the 10th century. These were the biographers of note, and very, very important they are. The tafsir literature, meanings, the commentaries on the Quran. You had old fellows like Tabri, who died in 923, and then Zamashkhari, died in 1144, who was a Mutazilite. And then you had Badawi, died in 1286, and Azrazi, and you had other modern ones like Qutb, who was executed by the Egyptian government, I think, in about 1966. These are modern fellows now. Maulana Maududi was a fundamentalist, and we're talking about him quite a bit in the course. Another fellow was Pervez, who was a modernist. So you've got that you've got that tafsir literature, in other words, the Quran. But you have the hadith literature as well. And the hadith literature is somewhat controversial because not everyone thinks the hadith literature is important. For instance, Allama Iqbal, who is called the father of Pakistan because he came up with the idea, died in 1938, was a modernist, so much so that they say he didn't even believe in heaven. We'll look at him later on. But he said, we don't need the hadith. Yeah, it's all right, if you study it, but we really don't need it. Well, the hadith literature is helpful to Muslims in the sense that it is a commentary on the Quran. So by reading the hadith, you can better understand the Quran, except that, they had some real problems with the hadith because there were some spurious accounts. And so one of them, the main one, Sahih al-Bukhari, who is one of the 6 canonized sets, he worked with 600,000 sayings and tried to filter them down. Another one was Sahih al-Muslim, another was Tirmizi, and Abu Dawud, al-Nasai, Ibn Majah. Those were the 6 canonized sets of literature. Now, I just mentioned them, and now they're there on the screen. Let's keep in mind that there are non-canonized, non-authentic hadith as well. Let me give you an example of some of the differences. They're not always this dramatic, but the non-authentic hadith talk about 72 virgins for each man, whereas the authentic ones are much, much less. I think 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is. Much, much less than for instance, Mishkat al-Masaba, which is a non-authentic sect, although much of the material is the same. Sometimes when Mishkat quotes something or says something, he'll say that this is also mentioned in al-Bukhari and al-Muslim. The hadith there are 2 sections, 2 parts of it. There's hadith al-Qudsi, which are the actual words of the Prophet, in other words, the most trustworthy, al-Qudsi, holy. And then there is the hadith al-Sharif, which are noble Sharif. Well, let's make some distinctions here between the hadith and the sunnah. There is a difference, particularly in the early ages of Islam, where the hadith was written accounts transmitted by a chain of authorities, whereas the sunnah was a form of behavior, a code of conduct of the Prophet. The traditions were, as I mentioned, written accounts transmitted by a chain of authorities. These were oral communications derived from the Prophet, whereas the sunnah referred to religious or legal points without regard to an oral tradition. I hope that's not too confusing to you, but there were, particularly in early Islam, some differences. Today, when you think of the hadith, you don't often spell out those fine distinctions. We just say the hadith says such and such. But in early Islam, particularly, there were some fine distinctions. This is brought out in a book written by John Gilchrist, Muhammad and the Christian, page 224. Or Kenneth Craig, The Call of the Minaret. He says that early Islam, there were far greater distinction between these two. And Goldsher, who wrote Muslim Studies in volume 2, page 24, says the terms, and I've just read that to you. So, again, these hadith are not of the same importance to all Muslims, but many of them are, particularly to fundamentalists. They put them almost side by side because, you know, the hadith is a record of what Muhammad said and did in general terms, and whatever he said and did is very, very important. Now, let's talk about just a few more things. I'll put them all on the board, and we will talk here about some commentaries. And this is where we'll end up. We will talk about these old commentators, these fellows who had the most influence. The first one was Abdullah ibn Abbas. He died in 688. Then there is al-Bukhari. We've already talked about him. And when I said commentaries, I don't mean just commentaries, because Bukhari did work in history and the hadith as well. But the greatest, I think, of them all, the king, the Dallas boy, if you will, or the Matthew Henry of Islam, was Tabri. Died in 923. Tabri was the mother of the exegesis. His full name was Abu Ja'far Muhammad al-Tabri. He wrote much history. He had a 32-volume commentary, if you could imagine. The interesting thing about Tabri is that he seems to be more honest. More honest in the sense that he does list variants. Well, variants in the sense that he looks at a Quranic passage and he says, well, you know, here are the various interpretations. And he lists them all. It's an exhaustive study, and can be exhausting too because it's 32 volumes. But it's more honest in that he will look at something like the death of Christ. Well, did he die? Didn't he die? Tabari would name them all possible interpretations, and one of the possible interpretations that he gives to those 4 passages on the death of Christ are that possibly he did die. That's not the one he chooses, but I like the fact that he does consider it, whereas commentators today in Islam on the Quran will not even list that possibility of interpretation. Now, I could have said more about this fellow here, Abdullah ibn Abbas. He was a scholar from northern Iran, and it's a little bit ambiguous where he was from, but he was a prolific writer on theology, literature, and history. And this fellow here, we could have said more about him too, like the fact that he apparently memorized the Quran by the age of 7. And he did a lot of study in fiqh, which is jurisprudence, and in poetry, and in math, and most important, in the recitation, memorizing and the recitation of the Quran. But keep in mind that Tabri is the mother of exegesis. So, but let's look at Zamakhshari as well. A very interesting fellow who died in 1144. By the way, a good resource here when you were thinking of it is a book by the name of Gatje, G-A-T-J-E, who wrote the exegesis of the Quran. His full name was Umar az-Zamakhshari. He was a Persian Arab scholar, and he came out with a 4-volume book, 4-volume work. Gives a lot of personal interpretation. He was brilliant. He was a great linguist, to say the least. And he does admit that some of the Quran is ambiguous. But he says it helps to do a linguistic study of parts of the Quran. But he wasn't as great as Tabri. You know, it sort of reminds you of when it lists in the book of Chronicles David's great men. And he says, you know, these were the great men. And these were the 3 were the greatest of them all. Well, we're talking here about the greatest commentators in Islam. And Zamakhshari did have some influence, but he was a Mutazilite. Gatchi says it's the quintessence of Mutazilite doctrine. He talks about things that the Mutazilites stressed, like the justice of God. And he rejected anthropomorphic concepts because, you see, they are not reasonable. Being a Mutazilite, he took the rationalist approach. He was a Persian with great authority in Arabic. Notice that you have the best of the two, Arabic and Persian. He believed in a created Quran. See, this is one of the major differences between the Mutazilites and the non-Mutazilites. And by the way, the Mutazilites were eventually shut out or shouted down. But that's Zamashkhari. Now, the other one here was Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, who died in 1201. He was a Persian Arab theologian. Again, a 32-volume work, published in Cairo. He died in 1209, as I might have mentioned. And it is a good Sunni exegesis. He opposed the Mutazilite interpretation of the Quran. And he was born in Tehran. He died in Herat. He was a philosopher and a historian of great distinction. He wrote History of Dynasties, and he belonged to the Shafi school. He defended orthodox views in his book Kitab-e-Muhassal and came out with a great exegesis of the Quran. Badawi was another one, died in 1286. His name was Abd Allah ibn Umar al-Badawi, Persian, and at times he condensed Zamashkhari's work, and at times he expanded it. He was many today Sunni theologians consider Badawi the best, sort of a manual for instruction. Others too include people like Jalal al-Din al-Muhalli and Jalal al-Din Sunniti. So that's the commentators. We've looked in this lecture at some of the earliest commentaries on the Quran, and we've also talked about some of that literature. Next time we'll go on to talk about some of the Shiite commentaries.